One thing that's important to be able to do is to have sort of a systematic way of troubleshooting your code. A lot of what we've done so far has been just with code that was generated by the scaffolding. And in the simple examples, not much can go wrong with them. There can be configuration issues and so on, or insulation issues, et cetera. But as far as the code goes, the code is pretty solid, the scaffolded code. But as we start putting more and more code into our programs, the more likely the chance that we might run into something that doesn't work. And it's kind of late in the semester for this. I'm not sure if I went over this earlier or not, but I want to remind you, if I've talked about it already, and introduce you, if I haven't, to a tool that you can use to figure out what's wrong with your program. What a lot of programmers tend to do is just stare at the code, and that very often doesn't lead to really good results. So what I want to do today is go over the debug tool. And this is an actual student problem. And this one actually, the problem took a long time the first time I saw it last semester, but this time it didn't take quite as long to find the issue because I had already seen it before. I just had to tap into my memory to remember exactly what I did to fix it last time. So anyhow, let's see the problem. This is the example with the meals and the categories. I'm not going to show you the code, so you can't, or all the code, so you can't copy that for your own. And I definitely not going to share the code. But when we run this example, we get to enter meals, and I already set all this stuff up, so don't have to worry about it, but I can log in. And I can go in here, and they have a drop down for the category, and that's cool. But if I enter values in here and here, and I collect the button, or I click the button, doesn't do anything. And in fact, our drop down is gone. So what do? All right. I'll tell you what I did to troubleshoot this. And again, it's not only important to show you the answer to a problem like this, but to show you the process I went through to get the answer. First of all, I went through and made sure that the database, the models in the database looked okay. So I looked at the models, they looked okay. Let me bring up specifically the meal model. Yep, that looks good. That looks good. These navigation properties, public int category ID, and as a required field. And I have as another navigation property, the category. So again, just as we saw in the example we looked at last time and we'll look at later today, we can get the category name that's related to a particular meal. All right, now, I also then double checked the database to make sure that the database was okay. There's a bunch of things here. How do you check the database? And this requires that you remember some of the stuff that you studied in CISS243 and hopefully we reviewed in this class. Wow, there's a lot of these open. All right. So what I went to for that is under View, I picked SQL Server Object. Now, because I have a bunch of SQL Server objects out there from all the stuff that I've graded, even probably from past semester, it's going to take a little while for me to find the database. For you, it should be a lot easier because you only have the stuff, obviously, that you worked on. But we'll go under SQL Server and under MS SQL local DB. I look at databases, and I see a whole bunch of things. And I happen to know from doing this yesterday that this, I believe, is the right database, because it names the database, includes in the database the name of our context. So this is lab_9 context. I can assure that it's this database, or I can be reasonably sure that it's this database. I go and look at the system, or look at the tables, and sure enough, it has category and meals. So what am I going to look like exactly? Well, what are some of the reasons that an insert can fail? An insert can fail if the database constraints are not met. And those can require things like if there's fields that are required and so on. So I'm going to look and make sure the database is configured correctly. So I look at the DB mail, because that's the one I'm having problems with. I notice that it correctly identified the primary key as being this field. I could look at properties. I need a wider screen. And if I look at the properties for that column, it is set as being, it is a primary key. All right. We can tell that also from what it shows in the description. Let me look at the model again. Is the key. This will turn out to be an auto increment T. I was going to try to show you that, but I'm not finding it right now. All right. The other constraints. There is an index on category ID. There's not a unique index on category key, however. And finally, there is a foreign key for category ID in this table. In other words, this has to match a category in the category table. Well, let's look up what the categories in the category table are. We can right mouse and view data. And we have one that is called test. So let's make sure our dropdown contains that one, all right, because that's what's going to get stuffed in the category ID in the meal table. All right, let me double check the meal table to make sure that those inserts really are failing. And they are. That table is empty. All right. So I'm going to run it again, and I'm going to look and I'm going to make sure that the dropdown is constructed for that foreign key the way that we expect it to. So I guess if I was summarizing, the first thing I'm doing is I'm making sure the database constraints are being met by what we try to insert. And if I look at create new, to log in, if I look at this dropdown, it's very useful that you can view the source of the page, because we can actually see the HTML that gets generated for the page that we have. And if we looked at this, the select statement is the dropdown. And if we look, the first option and the only option has a description of test, and it has a value of 1. And the value of 1 is what the script is going to use. So that dropdown appears to be correct. Where is that dropdown set? Well, let's look in the insert models, or the insert for meals, the page model associated with that. Okay. We look here, and actually, it looks like this looks like something that maybe Oh, I'm looking at the index. I need to look at the insert, which is actually not insert, but create. All right. We look at the create, the dropdown is formed this way. ViewData. ViewData is a way to pass data from the model to the Razor page itself, equals new select list from context category, and we want the content category ID and the short description. So that's how that was formed. All right. And then the drop down for that, I'm all over the place here. The drop down for that says get the drop down, select ASP form meal category ID. It gets its items from the view bag, which is another name for the way to pass data back and forth, category ID. All right. So we're able to pull that drop down. So view, what did I say that was? View data and view bag are just two different ways to pass data to the other page. And again, we created a thing called ViewData and we grabbed it with the same name, ViewData, or ViewBag rather, dot category ID. All right, so the dropdown's okay. Let's look at the code that gets ran when we post. It's not the onGet, all right? It's not the onGet, because that runs the initial time the page loads. It, however, is on post async. So in other words, when this page is submitted back to itself, it uses a post to pass the data back to it. And if we look at the CSS_HTML, we can look method equals post. So it's going to call itself back and it's going to post the data. So our code that's going to process that posting is going to appear in the post section. All right, the first instruction is model valid, invalid, return. It's doing these things. It would be nice to know exactly where this blew up. And we can't necessarily determine that just by staring at the code. All right, so I'm going to go into debug mode. And what debug mode does is it allows us to point to an instruction and set what's called a breakpoint. A breakpoint means when the computer gets to execute that statement, it's going to not proceed. It's going to instead show us sort of a snapshot of all our variables and objects and what's going on so we can look at it and identify it. All right, so notice, if the model state is not valid, well, what does that mean? Gets a value that indicates whether any model state's values is invalid or not validated. What do we mean by that? We mean all these things in the model. For example, it would not be validated if there was no name entered because the name is required. Likewise with price, likewise with category. So if one of those is not entered, the valid flag is going to be false. So maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's not. Maybe the problem is somewhere down here. I'm going to debug it and I'm going to see exactly where the problem is. And then I'm going to zoom in to look at the different variables to try to troubleshoot this. So I'll go up here, stop debugging. All right. I'm going to start again. We haven't hit that line of code yet. I hit meals, create new, log in, type the name in, type in 11 for the price, and I choose the category from the dropdown, and I hit create. Well, it stops at that line of code, which of course it does. That's the code that's part of the onPost method. So I can hover over the different properties and it can show me the value of those. So in this case, the model is not valid. The model has a value of false. So somehow in the validation, it's not working. So I could see what happens next by going into step into. Step into again, it's going to return the page. All right. And it's going to return the page, but since it wasn't called by the get, the dropdown is not going to get set. So that's why the dropdown disappears. So we have to kind of figure out what is wrong with the model state. What validation error does it think? Because we went through and we made sure all the fields had values. The foreign key looks like it's correct. Everything looks correct. So we have to figure out exactly what the issue is. So if we go down here, when you're running debug, you have a locals window that will tell you everything about the object that is currently going on. So this relates to the page itself, the page model itself. There's a whole bunch of things associated with it. We can look at the meal to make sure. The category ID is 1 because it's an auto number key. The meal ID is 0. Well, this is an auto number. It figured out that this is an auto number field, so it's going to increment that. The name is pancakes. The price is $11, just as we entered. Now, what's something that looks suspicious is this category being null. All right. What does that mean? Well, we can look actually at the model state, and we can look at the validation state. That is showing up as being invalid. So we're correct. It's not passing validation. Oh, we can look at this here. Is valid as false. Look at error count. There's 1 error. Look at count. It's a count of the total things that's validating. That's 4. I'm missing something here. Just pardon me for 1 minute. If model state is valid, oh, here we go. The values associated with it. If I look at the different things, these are the different conditions. Is the meal name valid? That's what I need to look at under values result view. There's so many attributes, it does get to be very confusing. What I'm asking you is not to become experts at being able to find your problems in a second by looking at the debug. I mean, sometimes it's difficult even for me to work through this. So don't feel bad, but at least make the effort, because sometimes it can point out to something that you're able to catch. And really from this point on, if you have an issue with the code, I'm going to ask you if you ran Debugger, because ideally you would have ran Debugger and seen what's going on and at least have an idea of what the problem is. If I notice though, this one's valid, this one's valid, this one is invalid, and this one is valid. And what does that relate to? That relates to the field called category. Well, what is the field called category? I can finish debugging now because I pretty well have the answer here. So I can stop debugging. What is the field category? Well, if we look at our model, the field category is this navigation property. And it's sort of a quirk of the validation that it validates to make sure that the category ID is required, but it's also requiring that this object, this navigation property, be filled in. And that's not going to be filled in initially when we do an insert. So that category variable is actually null, and it's expecting it to exist because we have not defined this as being optional. Therefore, one of them is required. So with an insert, that navigation property is not populated immediately. And therefore, this fails because this is required. If I put my mouse over it, it sort of even gives me a warning that it's a non-nullable property. So what we have to do is we have to make this optional. How do we do that? We put a question mark after the class name. All right. We're not invalidating the foreign key. We're not saying the foreign key is invalidated. We're talking about this navigation property. It will still get populated correctly. However, there's some issue where when we initially do the validation, and I would say that's an issue with the framework, not a problem of ours, and this is sort of our workaround. I saw online when I researched this a bunch of different workarounds. This seems the most simple and straightforward. So now when I run this, I can go into meals, create new, log in. Pancakes, $11. Choose from the drop-down test, click create. It stops there. Notice this time the is valid flag is true in the model state. So I can just continue, and it added it. So if you're seeing a problem like this, what I would like you to do is verify what the value of that is valid flag is. If it's not being updated, if the database is not being updated, there's a good chance that there's some sort of validation error. And specifically, there's a good chance there could be a validation error with the navigation property. So if you have a problem like this, run debug and look at the code and see if you can trace exactly where the problem comes from. But this debugger is very valuable. You can use it to do all sorts of cool things. All right, I'm going to go back over I always want to say Costco University. I know it's not Costco. I want to go over that project because last time, if I recall, we got part of the way through it, but we didn't get through everything. So I don't know if we were going to get through everything even today, but we'll see a lot of the stuff. And certainly some of the stuff you can read through on your own and try to work out. And if you have questions, you can ask me. So I'm going to close all these guys down. I was hoping there was a close everything. It remembers what was open the last time and opens it again. There's a few things I forgot to mention last time as well. So we'll look at those today. I think I closed looking at this functionality dealing with the instructor. If we run this and go to the instructor, there's something that we haven't seen before. There's a select link. Normally we've seen the edit, delete, or details link. Here with instructor, we have seen the select, edit, details, and delete. So those work like they did before in other things. If I click select though, what happens is it populates a second table here with all the courses that that particular instructor teaches. And sure enough, you look, there's a match. Here it just shows a couple pieces of information. This displays all the information. And if we select that, we can see the students. Now notice the URL. It's recalling this page, but it's adding information each time. So let me start off with this. And let's follow the URL. Instructor 5 is pulling up this list. I select this guy. All right. That calls this and passes the ID number of this person. Then if I click select, oh, I already clicked select. It brings up the courses for that instructor. So there's an instructor ID. Here, if I click it, there's a course ID. And if we look at the instructor index, particularly the model, I'm spending most of my time speaking about the model because in my mind, that is what is the most involved and the most difficult. And when I say model, I really mean the page model. Notice how the model. All right. I'm going to point something out and we're going to nothing. All right. This doesn't do what I thought it did. All right. Notice how on get async, it looks to see if there's an optional ID and an optional course ID. And if there is an ID, if it's not null, it goes and grabs all the instructors for that, and then grabs all the course assignments for that instructor. Follows that navigation property. Because when we search for the instructors, what did we do? We included the course assignments. If we did the second select and we selected the course ID, we grab the course ID and grab the course that matches it, go out to the enrollment and grab the list of the enrollments that is for that course. And then for each one, we load the student information for that student. Let's see. Course ID, selected course, that pulls up in instructor data, the courses, all right, where the course equals the course ID. We then, for each enrollment in select course enrollment, we load asynchronously a local environment variable enrollment, all right, that goes and grabs all of the students that are associated with that, all right, and then we return the enrollments, the selected courses enrollments. So the selected courses enrollments equal the enrollments for that particular course that the instructor has. All right. Let's look now at, notice that we have a public instructor data here. All right, what is the instructor data? In other examples of this, if we look, for example, at the student model, we have a list of students, a paginated list, and we'll talk about what that means, if not today, then later on. Because again, there's a ton of stuff in this particular example. So instead, we have not students or not instructors that you might expect, but we have a model called Instructor Index data. So if we look at the model for the index, we have an instance of Instructor Index data. That's a model that we constructed, all right? So here's something that we have not seen before. You can actually create a model that contains related records to the entity that you're talking about. Because if we look at this, this contains an instructor, or a list of instructors, rather, a list of courses, and a list of enrollments. So remember, this is used to pull up the courses for that instructor. This is used to pull up the enrollments in the selected course. So the index requires these three entities to do that nice little expansion of each step. So therefore, we create a model that has those. So we don't have to deal with the three models on their own. We can deal with them as one unit. So that's something that we can do, and something that is beneficial in this example. And that's why we can go and here and pull from the instructor data the specific instructor that we want, and then from them pull the specific courses that the instructor teaches. That's where the data is coming from this model, because this contains everything in it. All right. And this goes in and looks for all the students associated with each of the enrollment rows that are in that table. We pull the courses from there, and we grab for those selected courses. We look where the enrollments, we look at the enrollments for that selected students, for that selected course, I mean. All right. Let's look at the insert and update for an instructor. I'm going to start looking at the insert, and then we'll talk about how the update is similar. So if I look at the insert, I keep wanting to say insert, it's actually create. If we look at the create model, notice what we have here. Oh, thank you. You right. I thought I had done that. Oh, I guess I didn't. Maybe I clicked here. Oh, that still does it. I'll be darned. Thank you. I clicked settings. Okay. That's what I had intended to do, but I must have clicked mistakenly in the wrong place. Thank you for that. Okay. Notice that normally when we look at these page models, we look at, for example, the courses. All right. Bad example. When we look at students. Normally, our page models inherit from page model. Now, I assume you all have an idea of what inheritance means. Inheritance means that my model is an example of a page model. And what that means is all the functions, all the methods, all the attributes, like that is valid flag that's defined as part of the page model, is also available on my model as well. But notice how that's different in case of the create for instructors. We don't say that it is a page model. We say it is inherited from instructor course page model. Okay, why did we do that? Well, we did that because between the create and the edit page, there's a lot of functionality that's repeated. For example, let's run this and look at some of the functionality that's repeated. All right, it shows a list of things that, it shows a list of courses that could be taught by that instructor. And I think that same thing exists on the create new. It does. So there's some functionality that shows both on the instructor edit and create. Because of that, they didn't want to duplicate that code. They didn't want to have the same code in the create page and the edit page. So they made their own page model, which inherits from page model, that does the things that we want to do. Now, I'm not going to go over this in too much detail because this one particularly is a pretty advanced, some very advanced things going on. You only need to do stuff like this if you want to maintain a sort of header detail relationship where you show an entity and you show all of the things that it could be related to and let the user select by a checkbox like we have here. This shows all the courses that exist in the table and allows us to add it to a instructor by checking it or delete it by unchecking it. That's sort of a pretty rare thing to do, to be honest. So I'm not going to really cover this in too much detail, other than to tell you that this page model has all the code that makes that happen. Essentially, it pulls up all the courses initially for that course ID or for that instructor ID. It then looks to see if the courses that we have edited, it compares the courses that we have edited with the instructor courses that we initially loaded, and we either do an update or we do a delete or an add of those. So we remove it, we create it, or I guess that's our only two choices. There could be an update choice if there was extra data associated with that assignment table. But again, we're not going to consider this in too much detail, other than to say that we have stuff that is shared between those two pages. So we made a custom page model file to simplify that. We also do that, we saw with courses, or maybe we didn't see it with courses. I don't think we talked about those yet. If we look at courses, we can look at the edit and the create. And if I don't want to look at the Razor pages, I want to look at the page models. The create and the edit. All right. Both of these I did the index again. Darn. Create and the edit. Both the create and the edit don't inherit from page model. They inherit from the specialized page model that we have created. When I say we, I mean the people that have developed this application, not me personally, because I did not develop this application. And what is in that page model? Well, the retrieval of the drop-down list is in that model. So I define that drop-down list inside my model, which means I don't have to duplicate this code in the edit and in the create, because I've inherited from that. That means that this method is available. And sure enough, this is why I think when I went over it last time, I might have been, or if I did go over this one last time, maybe I'm thinking of when I was reviewing this on my own. There's a populate drop-down list, and we don't see it anywhere. Anytime you see a function called where you don't see it in the class itself, it comes more than likely, it comes from the parent class, the superclass of it. So in this case, since our create and edit are inherited from department name page model, we could call this function populate drop-down list because its attribute is available on the superclass. Then it's also available on the subclass. All right. Notice what this does. This pulls, this takes the context, which effectively is a database that you're connected to, and the whether or not there's a selected department. All right. What is the purpose of that? That is the purpose of, in an edit, we don't want to set the dropdown with the first department. We want to set the dropdown with the department that was entered previously. So we do our query from D in context departments, order by D name, select D. And then we create a new select list from this. And it includes department name, a department ID, name, and it's going to select the selected department if there is one. If it's null, then we don't do that. No tracking is used for tracking changes to entities that occur. Like if I was editing something at the same time and someone else is editing it. You know, in this case, because it's read only and they recommend to avoid tracking to not set up the extra overhead on the server. All right, so that's how we create that. And we do the same thing in edit. And so we have our drop-down list, and we can use that in the Razor page to do what we need to do. Let's see what we have not looked at. We looked at courses right now, and the interesting about them, we looked at departments the other day. We looked at instructors. I guess that only leaves students left. And with students, we have a custom class that we've created. This actually threw me when I was going over this for the first time because it's way down here. And it's called paginated list. And what that means is it's likely that you do not want to display all members of an entity on the screen at the same time. Like if we were scrolling through a list of students, even a search result for students, I might only want to show 10 students per page. And if there was more, I'd click next page and then next page and so on. So in order to demonstrate this without having hundreds of students, they made the page size 3. So if we go to the student index, we get the first 3 students and then have a previous and next. Well, we're already at the beginning, so the next is disabled, or the previous is disabled. The next takes us to the next group. Now previous and next are enabled. We can go to the next. Now next is disabled. so we can page between those. All right. So how did they accomplish that? The first thing they did is they had a class called paginated list. And let's see what that is used for. It accepts what's called a generic, so we make a list of something. When we define that we want a paginated list, we define what object we want the list made of. In our case, it's going to be students. What it's going to do is it's going to look at the list of items that it gets sent as an argument, the count of how many we want, or the count of the number of elements, that the page that we're on, and the page size. And what it does, first of all, is it calculates the number of pages that we have, and it looks to make sure whether the previous or next page should be enabled or not. And then it creates, what it actually does is it doesn't pull all of the students from the source. It only pulls the number that we want starting at however far we are in. So if we show 3 on a page, if we were displaying page 2, it would skip the first 3, and then it would get then it would compute and grab the next number of students from the list. So we use that in our student index. We grab our student, we possibly do our search, we do our sort order, and then our students that we're going to display, we have a page size of 3, is going to be, our list of students is going to come from this paginated list. So it's not going to have all of the students in it. It's just going to have 3 students at a time, and it's going to skip all the students that came previous based on the page that you're currently on. If you have no page index, it's going to use page 1. So if we haven't done any search before, it's going to use page 1. All right. I realize these things are complicated. I would urge you to take some time to study this example in particular. And the one thing that I think is complicated, and if it gets too much, you can skip it, deals with the code that is in the instructors create and create and edit. The one that uses the the one that uses the instructor course page. That code is very involved, and more than likely, you probably won't need to do something like this on your project. By all means, I don't want to discourage you from taking a look at it if you're interested, but I would look at the other bits of functionality that we have covered in this example and make sure we study them. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, do remember you have do remember that we have a project due, so start working on that. The end of the semester is coming quicker than you might think. So work on your project. Ask me any questions you might have. There might be something in your project that goes over something that we haven't talked about before, in which case I'll be glad to assist you in working through that. So if there are no questions, we'll see you next week.